How do you learn vocabulary in English? If you're watching this video, that's probably because you're learning English. So this question is relevant to you. And honestly, you've learned a lot of vocabulary already if you can watch my videos and understand what I'm saying. So the question isn't so much how is it possible to learn vocabulary, because obviously people learn vocabulary when they learn other languages, and it's not rocket science, as we say. However, I wanted to do this video more about the struggles that people have when they think about the best ways for them to acquire new vocabulary, learn new phrases and expressions, and they want to do this effectively and have the best techniques to employ in their language learning practice, their language learning process. So I've talked about this topic in different episodes of my podcast before, but I want to do a YouTube video on this topic because I have a theory regarding learning vocabulary, and this theory is based on my experience as a language learner, and other people might disagree with me about this, but I think my theory makes sense, and I think if you understand it well, it will help you in the sense that you won't get as frustrated about not learning vocabulary really fast or easily, or feeling like you forget vocabulary words all the time. I think after you watch this video, you'll have a better idea of how to think about this process of learning vocabulary. And at the end, I'm going to give you kind of like a shortcut, kind of like a way to make things go faster, let's say. But first, let me tell you about my theory. Okay, so when I talk about this theory, I use the term threshold. So let me just explain that. So in this context, when I talk about learning vocabulary and I say you reach a certain threshold, what I mean by that is you hear the same word or phrase a certain number of times until eventually you reach this magic number, this threshold. And once you reach that, then you know the word and you don't forget it after that. So that's what I'm going to be referring to when I say this threshold, this certain number where the change happens, okay? So here's my theory. What I've noticed as a language learner is that every word and every phrase that you come across in the language that you're learning, so in your case, English, every word and every phrase that you want to learn has a certain threshold that you need to reach in order to know that word, okay? So for example, let's say there's a new word that you see, and that word is threshold. Let's say that's the word, and you have no idea what it means the first time you see it. And then eventually you see it again the second time, and you've already forgotten what it meant, the meaning that you looked up, or that you found when you looked it up the first time, right? And then you remember, oh yeah, I remember looking up that word. What did it mean? Oh yeah, okay, it's this. And then days go by, weeks go by, and you don't see the word threshold again. And then you see it again, and you go, oh yeah, I know I've seen that word, but I don't remember what it means. And this process just keeps on going. And let's say you see that word 25 times and you still can't remember what that word means, even though you looked it up many times. Eventually, you're going to reach this magic number, this threshold, where when you see it this time, it kind of puts you over the edge, as we say, and now you are familiar with that word. Now the next time you see it, you know what it means. You remember it, okay? And let's say that threshold is 30 repetitions. So when you see the word threshold 30 times, then on the 30th time, now you can finally remember that word and what it means. So in my theory, and what I've noticed, and this is pretty obvious, is that each word and each phrase has a different threshold. You don't know when you're eventually going to reach that magic number of repetitions where now you know the word. You don't know how many times it's going to take. There are a lot of factors involved. If you see that word once today, and then you see it the second time next year, and then you see it the third time the year after that, you're probably not going to remember that word at all the second time or third time. But maybe you see the word today, and then you see the word tomorrow, and you forgot it, but you kind of remember seeing it, and then you see it the next day, and then that third time that you see it, you kind of remember what it means. That's different than if you saw it today and then next year and then a year after that. So obviously the frequency, how much time between repetitions, that's a factor. There are a lot of other factors probably involved in this, but at the end of the day, you need to see these different words. When I say see, I mean you hear them or you read them. You need to see these words a certain number of times, and then finally, once you reach that magic number, you know the word. But you have no idea what that number is. Maybe for this word, you only need to see it 10 times, and then you have that word. And then this word, you need to see it 80 times, and then you have it. And then this word, you need to see it 100 times. It's different for every word, and you don't know what that magic number is. So when you're listening and reading and you're getting the repetition of different words and phrases, you're getting closer to the threshold for each of these different words and phrases, but you just don't know what that threshold is, what number you need to reach, okay? But by listening and reading, you get closer to this number for each of the different new words or words that you're not very comfortable or familiar with. So that's kind of the overall theory here. And I'm going to talk about how, like I mentioned at the end, about kind of like a shortcut to make this threshold number lower. But first, let me just talk a little more about the frustration that people have with learning vocabulary. So, as I just said, the basic answer to the question, how do you learn vocabulary, is that you need to have repeated exposure to those words and phrases, and eventually you hear it enough times that now you know the word, or now you know the phrase, okay? So it's pretty basic, it's pretty simple, and that's most likely how you've learned the words that you know right now in English. But here's the issue. When you're a beginner, when you're just starting to learn English, the words that you're learning are usually at the beginning very basic words, words that are very functional, that have a lot of usages that are really essential for English. So, like the word and, or the word but, or the word after, or whatever, right? All these words that you hear over and over again all the time. Because these kind of basic words are so common, you reach that threshold very quickly with these words when you start learning English, because you hear the word and like every 2 sentences you hear that word. So, if you listen to English for 1 hour, maybe you hear the word and like 300 times in that 1 hour. So you can see how quickly you can reach that number, that threshold for the word and, because you're going to hear it so many times in all kinds of sentences. However, a word that is much less common, let's say the word marker. The marker is what we use to write on whiteboards and things like that. That's not a super uncommon word. Like, a lot of us use markers on a daily basis to write on, like I have this whiteboard planner right here, or maybe you're a teacher and you write on a whiteboard with a marker. It's not that uncommon of a word, but it's much, much less common than the word and. So it's going to take you a lot longer to hear the word marker 10 times than it will to hear the word and. All you need to do is listen to 2 minutes of English, and you've probably heard the word and like 10 times. You probably need to listen to, I don't know how many hours, dozens of hours, hundreds of hours of English to hear the word marker 10 times. Do you get what I'm saying? So those basic words that you need at the beginner level, you learn them very quickly because there's so much repetition of those words. However, once you reach an intermediate level, then you already know the basic words. So now the words that you don't know, it takes you a really long time to actually hear them many times so that eventually you reach that threshold, that magic number, and now you know the word, right? Because those words don't come up very often, okay? I don't know the exact statistics, but if you take the most common words in English, let's say the 100 most common words, or the 200 most common words, or whatever, those words make up a very large percentage of the words that we use on an everyday basis. And then the words that aren't in that top 200 word list or whatever, those words, even though there are, thousands and thousands of words that are there that aren't part of the top 200, even though there are thousands and thousands and thousands of words, those words, like each individual word in that group, shows up so little in comparison to like the top 200 words. So it's just logical that once we reach an intermediate level, the vocabulary that we lack, that we don't have yet, takes a lot longer to learn because we just don't hear those words repeated that often, right? You're not going to hear the word marker repeated that often. That's just the reality of language learning. So because of that, when people reach an intermediate level, they usually feel like they're not improving anymore. They feel like they're not really making progress because they're not gaining that much new vocabulary compared to when they were at the beginner level learning all of these basic useful words, right? So here's the problem with that mindset, because you might have that feeling as well. Like, I'm stuck at this intermediate level. I'm doing all kinds of English practice, but I'm not improving, right? Well, that's not necessarily true, because imagine this scenario. Let's pretend that you see the word marker, okay? Let's say last year you saw that word 10 times, okay? And you still can't remember that word right now, but this year you've seen it an additional 20 times. So now you've seen that word 30 times, but you still can't remember that word when you're speaking, right? And so you might think, well, I've seen that word so many times, I just can't remember it, I'm not improving. But what you don't realize is that maybe the threshold for the word marker for you is 31 times. Maybe when you hear it 31 times, then it clicks and you've reached the threshold, and now you know the word, you remember it, you can use it, but you've only heard the word marker 30 times. Well, you don't realize that you just need one more good repetition of that word, and then you're going to know it. You don't know that. You don't know where that threshold is. To you, it just feels like you're not improving, you're not remembering these words, whatever. But in reality, last year, you had heard that word 10 times, and this year, you've reached a total of 30 times in total. And so you've gotten very close to that threshold of 31 times, and you don't realize it, but really you've improved because you've increased the number of times that you've seen that new word, that vocabulary word. And so you're closer to actually remembering it and being able to use it now. So even if you're not reaching all of these different thresholds every day, all the time, if you're doing your English practice, if you're listening every day, if you're reading, then you're getting closer to each of these thresholds. So you are improving. It's just that it takes you longer to reach these different thresholds. So because of that, you have the feeling that you're not improving because you just know that you still don't know this word and this word, even though you have seen them multiple times. But in reality, you're getting closer. Okay? So I hope that makes sense, because I think it's logical, but it's good to hear someone say it like this, because I think that almost everyone reaches this point when they have an intermediate level where they feel like they aren't learning as much, they aren't progressing as much, and there are all these complicated words and phrases that they just don't know and can't remember or whatever. But really, it's just a matter of repeated exposure to those words. You'll eventually reach the threshold for each one if you continue to do your listening and your reading practice and your speaking, because this can come out during conversations as well from your teacher, or maybe you need to say that word and then you're able to ask the teacher and then they say it. So in conversations as well, you can get repetition of these different words. But let me talk just briefly about how you can speed this process up, because the answer to the question of this video, right? How do you learn vocabulary in English? I've already answered that, right? You need repeated exposure through reading and listening. And once you reach a certain threshold for a certain word, then you just know that word after it. You've heard it in many different contexts and you just know what it is now. Okay. So that's the basic answer. But this is how you can make those thresholds lower. So maybe instead of needing to hear the word marker 31 times, you can lower that threshold to just 5 times or something like that. And that is that you need to be exposed to these vocabulary words or phrases in contexts that are extremely interesting to you or extremely relevant to you. For example, let's say you're watching this video right now and you're just really interested in improving your English. You just really want to know how to better learn vocabulary. And so you're really interested in what I'm saying right now. Well, I bet that for many of you, before this video, you didn't know the word threshold. You didn't know what that word meant. But now I've used this word a number of times in this video, and you're really engaged right now. You are really interested in this topic of learning vocabulary in English. And because of that, maybe after this video, since I've already said the word threshold like I don't know how many times, but many times, maybe because you were so interested in this content that the context in which I used the word threshold was so much more powerful than if you just read it in some book. Oh, blah, 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 threshold, blah, 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 right? This content is so much more interesting to you that repetition of the word threshold is so much more powerful. And now after hearing it 5-10 times, you know it. And after this video, you know that word. And then you go and start using it, right? So maybe in other contexts, it would have taken you a lot longer, many more repetitions, because those contexts weren't as interesting for you. So what I'm saying here is that when you hear new words and phrases in a context that's really important to you, really relevant to you, or just really interesting to you, that repetition of that word is much more powerful. You're much more likely to remember that word, and that word will have more meaning for you. So you will be able to learn it after fewer repetitions, not that many, okay? This has happened to me all the time. There are certain words in French, for example, that I've seen so many times and I still can't remember exactly what they mean. I just hear them in different contexts and in different videos, and every time I'm like, oh, what does that word mean again? I don't remember. But there are other words that have appeared for the first time in a context that was so interesting for me. It was like in a sentence that was so relevant, a sentence that like I want to say because it's so relevant to me. And because that context was so interesting for me, I was able to learn that new word after hearing it like twice. I mean, a huge difference from some of these other words where I've heard them like 50 times and I still can't remember what they mean. So you can see how powerful the context is. If you're hearing words in a context that's really interesting for you, you're much more likely to remember that word. It's going to have more meaning for your brain. So you won't need to hear it as many times after that to learn it. Maybe you just need to hear it a couple more times and then you're good. You know what it means. So how can you do this? How can you have really a really interesting context for yourself? Well, you should be using content that you're really, really interested in. For me, for example, I'm super interested in languages and language learning. So like, for example, I'm listening to a podcast about languages, but this podcast is in French. Okay. So, yes, I'm using it to learn French, but I'm just really interested in the topic of the podcast. And so sometimes they'll say new words or new phrases in that podcast within a context that is so interesting for me that I hear that word once and then maybe they repeat it one more time in the episode and then I know the word. It's like I use it in my conversation the next day with my French tutor, for example. So use content that's really interesting for you. If you're super interested in language learning, use content about language learning where an English speaker is talking about learning languages. Does that make sense? So that's a pretty easy way to do this. And you're learning English, so you have tons of content about every subject. So that's really cool. And one other thing that I would encourage you to do is have conversations about subjects that are really interesting for you with people that you like. So I've talked about this before. I think I just recorded a podcast episode about this. I make so much content that I can't remember which topic was in which video or episode, but I talked about speaking English, and I think it was a podcast episode, and I was talking about finding a tutor, or more than one tutor, like 2 or 3 people that you really like, you get along with them, you share some interests with them. There are some topics where you both just really, really like that topic and have conversations about this topic. I find that when I'm having conversations in French, I learn words, first of all, in this really interesting context. Like we're talking about something that is really interesting for me, so I remember this word that my tutor says, for example. Or when I'm having conversations, sometimes I'm trying to say a sentence and I go, oh, I really want to say this, but I don't know how to say it. And then my tutor helps me say it. And then I'm able to say this sentence with that new phrase or whatever. And that has such a powerful impression on my mind because I used it in my own sentence in a very relevant situation. I'm the one talking. I want to express this thought. And because this phrase is in that sentence that I myself wanted to say, it's worth more, let's say, than just if I saw that phrase by itself in some book somewhere, let's say. So through my own speaking, I can kind of fill those gaps in my sentences with words that I don't have, but I really need. And when I do that, that tends to have a better, a more profound effect than when, like I said, I'm just listening to something or reading something irrelevant to me and I see the word. Okay, so if I need the word in my own sentence to express my thought, and then my tutor gives me that phrase and then I use it in my sentence, after that, I probably only need to hear that same phrase a few more times and then I got it. And then I reached that threshold. So I hope you kind of got my point with this video about how we learn vocabulary and, this idea about hitting that threshold with different words and how you can lower the number of that threshold, right? You can learn words faster through using content that's really interesting for you or having conversations that are really interesting for you, okay? So I also want to encourage you to use my advanced podcast episodes if you haven't done that yet. So in those episodes, I talk at normal speed and I give you the transcript of everything that I say. So maybe that's the next step for you, for your listening. So if you're interested in that, make sure to go down and click on the link down below. And I also encourage you to sign up for my US Conversations podcast. In that podcast, I talk to people from all around the United States. It's really interesting, and I also provide the transcript with the definitions of key words and phrases that we use. So that's something that will be really helpful for you if you're trying to reach that level where you can understand more than one person talking. Okay, so the link is also down below. All right, I hope this video was interesting and useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.